Galadriel is among the most powerful and mysterious characters in The Lord of the Rings, and her long history stretches back to the earliest days of Middle-earth itself. From her blessed beginnings to her final journey, here is Galadriel's entire backstory explained. Galadriel's life began back in the earliest recorded days of elven history. When the elves first awake in Middle-earth, they're initially led by the godlike beings known as the Valar, who live far across the sea in a westernly realm known as Valinor. The elves first come to Valinor to help protect them from the Dark Lord Morgoth, a fallen Vala who's hell-bent on wiping out both the elves and pretty much the rest of creation too. In fact, one of the origin stories for the orcs suggests that Morgoth caught some of these young elves before they migrated west, torturing them half to death and slowly turning them into the first generation of orcs.
Do you know how the orcs first came into being? They were elves once.
Over time, many of the elves that aren't captured or killed make their way across Middle-earth until they arrive at their new home, and it's here, roughly 3,000 years later, that Galadriel is born. For the record, that makes the Lady of Lórien over 8,000 years old when the events of The Lord of the Rings takes place. In her youth, Galadriel maintains a stellar reputation in the Heavenly Kingdom. She's born into royalty and is both an impressive lore master and a gifted athlete. According to Tolkien's Unfinished Tales, she's said to be the tallest of all the women of the Eldar and is recorded to be around 6 foot 4 inches in height. While her beauty is brought up on multiple occasions, however, it's her hair that is most frequently mentioned. In the Silmarillion, it's stated that her hair was lit with gold as though it had caught and enmeshed the radiance of Lórien. Lórien, as it happens, was one of the 2 magic trees that lit Valinor before the sun and moon were created. In his book Unfinished Tales, Tolkien even suggests that Galadriel's hair is like the light of both trees mixed together, and that it inspires the great elven craftsman Fëanor to create the Silmarils, the titular jewels of the Silmarillion. The Silmarils eventually attract the attention of Morgoth, who had previously destroyed the 2 trees and sets himself on stealing the jewels, sparking a devastating war with the elves in the process. Galadriel's royal pedigree makes it difficult for the elven princess to avoid the limelight, and eventually, her lofty position drags her into one of the most infamous events in Middle-earth's early history. When Morgoth destroys the 2 trees and steals the Silmarils, it sparks a rebellion in Valinor. Feeling betrayed by the Valar Guardians, a large faction of elves decide to reject their protection in Valinor, opting to take things into their own hands instead, by chasing the enemy back to Middle-earth, where he's fled with their priceless gems. One group of these elves seizes a fleet of ships by killing their elven guard and sail back across the sea to the western shores of Middle-earth. The larger host, with Galadriel in their midst, doesn't participate in this battle, but they're nonetheless unsettled by the coming of Morgoth and feel a powerful calling to return to the lands that they came from. So they too decide to leave Valinor. With no ships left behind by Fëanor's elves, however, they're forced to travel northwards across a stretch of land known as the Helcaraxë. The Helcaraxë is where Valinor and Middle-earth come closest together. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien describes the Helcaraxë as a place filled with vast fogs and mists of deathly cold, and the sea streams are filled with clashing hills of ice and the grinding of ice deep sunken. Needless to say, many elves perish in the crossing, but the survivors do eventually reach the shores of Middle-earth. Once Galadriel arrives back in Middle-earth, she spends the next several hundred years lying low. By this point, the first age of Middle-earth has begun, and the land is ravaged by war, as the elves and their allies are slowly ground down by Morgoth and his armies. Eventually, after 500 years of conflict, the Valar themselves arrive to take on Morgoth and cast the Dark Lord into the void of space. Notably, during this time, Galadriel visits the elven kingdom of Doriath, and it's here that she meets an elven prince named Celeborn. The two fall in love and eventually marry. Soon, Galadriel and Celeborn pack up and head further eastwards, leaving all the politics behind in search of a peaceful existence deeper within the continent. When the First Age ends with the defeat of Morgoth, many of the exiled elves return to Valinor. Some of them, however, head further east, where they find Galadriel and Celeborn already settled down.
At this point, Middle-earth has entered the Second Age, still over 6,000 years from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which take place at the end of the Third Age.
With the world changed immeasurably since the dark days of Morgoth, Galadriel and Celeborn begin to dabble with the idea of taking on legitimate political leadership. Just what happened next is kind of up in the air, however, partly because Tolkien mentions contradictory details in each version of the story that he wrote. What is known is that during this time, Galadriel and Celeborn lead two separate elven communities in northwestern Middle-earth, roughly 750 years into the Second Age. They move on and head southeast into Eregion, an area ruled by a distant cousin of Galadriel's named Celebrimbor. This is the same region where the Fellowship of the Ring is later tracked by birds and finds the doors of Moria.
From there, Galadriel eventually makes a trip with her daughter, Celebrian, through the Dwarven Mines, and pays her first visit to the elves that live in Lórien. Celeborn, who isn't all that fond of dwarves, remains behind for the time being.
By this point, a new foe has set himself up in Middle-earth, Morgoth's chief necromancer and second-in-command, Sauron.
You probably know what happens next. In disguise, Sauron visits the elven kingdoms of Middle-earth, charming them with his knowledge and teaching them how to forge rings of power.
One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness, find them.
After Celebrimbor forges the three elven rings, one is given to Galadriel.
But when Sauron creates his master ring, he's unable to use it to control the elves because he didn't physically have a hand in their creation. Realizing what has happened, the elves take off their rings and decide to keep them hidden from the new Dark Lord. When Sauron forges the One Ring and reveals his true identity to Middle-earth, it begins the War of the Elves and Sauron, which ends roughly 300 years after Galadriel first arrived in Lórien. After the war wraps up, she leaves Lórien and heads back east to find Celeborn. Eventually, the two meet again in Rivendell and decide to wander Middle-earth. During this period, they spend a good amount of time in Rivendell itself, as well as the area that eventually becomes Western Gondor. A lot happens in Middle-earth over the next few thousand years, to say the least, but it doesn't seem like Galadriel or Celeborn have much impact on these events. In fact, it's not until the Third Age that everything changes for the couple. In the 1981st year of this era, long after Sauron's defeat at the hands of the Last Alliance, the King of Lothlórien dies. Celeborn and Galadriel then return to the Woodland Kingdom, where they officially become the Lord and Lady of the Galadhrim.
Tolkien goes to great pains on multiple occasions to point out that Celeborn and Galadriel aren't the straight-up rulers of Lórien, but there's no doubt that at this point, they're the top dogs in the Golden Wood.
After she takes up leadership of Lothlórien with her husband, Galadriel spends the next few centuries using her knowledge and her ring to help the land blossom, preparing it for the inevitable conflict she knows is coming. Then, 2,463 years into the Third Age, Galadriel calls the White Council for the first time. This was a group of wise leaders in Middle-earth that included, among others, Saruman, Elrond, and Gandalf. Initially, Galadriel attempts to make Gandalf the head of this Council of the Wise, but the wizard turns down the honor, and Saruman ends up getting the nod instead. By now, the White Wizard is already starting to turn away from the light, and he intentionally steers the Council in the wrong direction on more than one occasion. Nevertheless, over the next 5 centuries, the White Council gets to work.
They identify the Necromancer in Mirkwood as Sauron, keep tabs on his ever-growing power, and eventually take action and drive him out of his fortress of Dol Guldur.
Beware the Necromancer. He is not what he seems.
Throughout all this drama, Galadriel remains intimately connected to the activities of the Council, frequently participating in its sessions and standing shoulder to shoulder with wizards and warriors alike, as they rally together to take on the greatest threat to Middle-earth since the fall of Morgoth.
For Tolkien movie fans, this will all begin to seem like more familiar territory. Having been revealed to the world by the White Council, Sauron retreats to Mordor. Galadriel, meanwhile, prepares Lórien for war. She plays her first critical role in the War of the Ring when she is visited by the Fellowship of the Ring after they escape from the mines of Moria. After she harbors the Fellowship, Galadriel gives them a number of important gifts and sends them on their way. She also welcomes a newly resurrected Gandalf, who's recovering from his epic mountaintop battle with the Balrog. Galadriel plays a crucial role in helping Gandalf to remember who he was, bringing him up to speed and equipping him with the knowledge he needs for the rest of the war.
Even after these two important events, Galadriel's role in the war continues. In the books, she sends a cryptic message to Aragorn, warning him that he must take the paths of the dead to help defeat Sauron's forces in Gondor. In addition, Lórien is attacked by orcs 3 times during the war, but Galadriel, her ring, and her elven armies repel all 3 attacks. After this, Galadriel and Celeborn lead their warriors into Mirkwood, where they capture Dol Guldur, and the Lady of the Wood uses her ring to utterly destroy its walls and cleanse the forest for good. At the end of the War of the Ring, Galadriel finally grows weary of the mortal lands of Middle-earth. She attends Arwen's wedding to Aragorn, and then, a couple of years later, decides to finally take a ship back to Valinor. Joining Elrond, Gandalf, Frodo, and Bilbo, Galadriel boards a ship and sails into the west. Celeborn, however, is unwilling to leave quite yet, and temporarily relocates to Rivendell, where Elrond's 2 sons still live. It's even said that Meriadoc Brandybuck traveled to the fading elvish stronghold to speak with Celeborn and ask for his help in compiling the history of the wars of Middle-earth. Eventually, though, the longing for both the West and his wife win out, and Celeborn joins Galadriel in their new home across the sea. While Galadriel's recorded life ends on this bittersweet note, there's one more part of her story that's worth mentioning. Gimli, the dwarf, is famous for his admiration of Galadriel, to the point he even asks for a strand of her hair to remember her by.
I asked her for 1 hair from her golden head. She gave me 3.
Interestingly, Tolkien also says that Galadriel manages to get permission from the Valar for Gimli to join her in retirement in Valinor itself, making him the only dwarf to ever set foot on the shores of the Undying Lands. This benevolent act is a fitting final footnote for the illustrious story of the most famous woman in Middle-earth's entire history. Check out one of our newest videos right here, plus even more Looper videos about your favorite movies are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.